Hi, my name is Lauren Cleveland from Lauren Cleveland Patterns, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Elizabeth mini dress. This is a pattern that I developed, actually my first ever pattern that I've developed, and my goal was to just make it extremely beginner friendly, really detailed instructions, avoiding any what I would consider to be advanced sewing techniques. Basically, avoid anything discouraging for a beginner sewist, but still allow you to create something you can be really proud of and incorporate into your day-to-day wardrobe. This dress is intended to be a layering piece. As you can see, it has quite a low cut in front, and it has a similar style on the back as well. So maybe something to be worn with a bandeau or a bralette, a long sleeve top. It really depends on what fabric you use and for what season you're styling this dress. In this tutorial, I'm going to be making a medium, but the pattern does come with 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. I'm going to show you how to make this garment from the very, very beginning all the way to the very, very end, including assembling the paper pattern itself. I'm going to show you how I go about cutting the fabric and following the paper pattern to do so. And then of course, I will show you all of the details around assembling the garment, sewing, gathering. So the fabric that I used for this particular Elizabeth mini dress and for quite a few others that I've sewn at this point is actually a bed sheet that I thrifted from Savers. I think there are pros and cons to using bed sheets. The pros, of course, being it's extremely cost effective. You can get one sheet for maybe a couple dollars and it yields quite a bit of fabric. But the cons of using bed sheets, and something that I would caution beginner sewists of when you're going to choose your fabric for making this pattern, is that bed sheets are very thin. A fabric being so thin can just make it challenging to work with. And in addition to that, a bed sheet can be quite slippery. It doesn't stay in place as well when you pin it. It might be shifting as you put it through your machine. If that's what works for you and you're ready to take that challenge, I encourage you to do so. So with all that being said, please enjoy, and I would love to see your finished product once you make your own Elizabeth mini. The first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have all the necessary materials and tools to complete the pattern. Next, we're going to take a look at how to assemble the pattern if you're printing it at home. Make sure that you're printing all of the pages to the exact size. If you were to scale them larger or smaller by accident, the pattern would not be correct. This is why there's a test square on the first page of the pattern. Once you have all the pages laid down in the correct order and taped together, you can cut out the pattern size that you desire. These pattern pieces are not designed with seam allowance included, so you will have to add that yourself. Weigh down your cutout pattern pieces with pattern weights or something similar. I use coasters, and simply trace around the edge of the pattern pieces. Keep in mind when you're laying out your pattern pieces on the fabric that you need to leave enough room for seam allowance. I should mention that I'm doing this with the fabric folded so that when I eventually cut out a pattern piece, I'm actually cutting 2 pieces at once. Once you have the pattern pieces traced, you're going to need to add your seam allowance. Once you've done that, I recommend pinning the folded fabric together so that it does not slide around or shift while you're cutting, and then using either fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, whatever you have on hand or works best for you, you're going to want to cut out those pattern pieces along the seam allowance. The next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that your darts are drawn onto each pattern piece. So all you really have to do is lay the pattern piece on top of the cut fabric you already have and trace that dart. What you see me doing is just drawing in that 1/2 inch seam allowance onto the pattern piece to help me align the dart properly. Now we're going to cut out the skirt, and as you'll notice from the pattern instructions, the skirt is essentially one long rectangle that we're going to gather at the waist. Here you can see me using a combination of my ruler and my triangle tool to just square out the corners that I'm going to cut from the fabric. The next thing you're going to need to do is sew along the darts on all 4 of the front bodice pieces. Here I'm showing you how I like to align my darts by using a pin or multiple pins along the length of the dart to ensure that I'm folding it in a way where each side of the dart is lining up perfectly on top of one another. Press your dart flat. and then you're going to feed it through your sewing machine, sewing right along that dart line. At this point, you should have 4 back bodice pieces, 2 right and 2 left, as well as 4 front bodice pieces, 2 left and 2 right. The front bodice pieces are the ones with the darts, and the back bodice pieces are the ones without darts. The next thing we need to do is sew the front bodice pieces to their corresponding back bodice pieces at the shoulder seam. Once you have those pieces sewn together, we're going to go over to our iron and press those shoulder seams open. You should now have 4 pieces in total. What you're going to want to do next is lay your bodice pieces right sides together. You're then going to sew along the long side seams. Do not sew the side seam underneath the armpit. I recommend lining up these pieces by the shoulder seams. As you can see, I've left that side seam underneath the armpit open and unsewn. This is going to allow us to turn the piece inside out and turn it into a loop. Next, you're going to want to take your loop turner or preferred tool to turn each of those bodice halves right side out. If you do not have a loop turner tool or similar, you can probably use a safety pin by just attaching it to one end of the loop and slowly feeding it through to the other end. Once you have those 2 bodice halves turned right side out, you're going to want to press all of those seams nice and flat. This can be a pretty tedious step, but just take your time and do your best. You're going to notice that the curved areas under the arm resist laying flat. The solution to this is to take your fabric cutting scissors and add some small snips along the seam allowance of the inner area. I actually do recommend doing this after you turn the piece right side out so that you're not jeopardizing the integrity of the fabric while you're turning it right side out and using a loop turner or other tool. Once you have those small snips in the curved area of the seam, you should be able to turn it back right side out and press it flat. Now, remember those side seams that I told you not to sew together before? This is the part where we finally sew those to the opposite side. You're going to want to pin these 2 sides right sides together, aligning them at the center seam. The front bodice pieces will have darts and the back bodice pieces will of course not have darts, but they should still align pretty well and be almost the same exact length. Once you have those side seams appropriately sewn together, turn the bodice back right side out and press all the seams nice and flat. You should now have 2 pieces total, 1 right front and back bodice piece and 1 left front and back bodice piece. This next step is totally optional and a stylistic choice. In these clips, I'm opting to add a decorative top stitch along the neckline and armholes. I recommend starting your stitch at an inconspicuous area. For example, when you add your top stitch to the armhole, you should begin your stitch right at the seam under the arm. For this next step, I'm going to be using my serger to finish the raw bottom edges of both bodice pieces. But if you don't own a serger, that's totally fine. You can use the zigzag stitch setting on your machine to achieve a very similar result. While it may not look as professionally finished, it should at the very least keep the fabric from fraying and the garment from coming apart. You're also going to want to serge or zigzag stitch the top edge of the piece you cut for your skirt. Next, you're going to want to fold over that top edge of your skirt piece that you just serged or zigzag stitched over about 3/4 of an inch and press. Once you have that pressed, you're going to want to turn your sewing machine to the basting stitch setting, which is essentially just the longest straight stitch your machine is capable of, and sew a basting stitch about a 1/2 inch from the folded edge that you just pressed down on your skirt piece. Now we're going to gather the waist of the skirt. Grab the top thread from the basting stitch that you just made. Through a combination of holding that thread taut and using your other hand to push the fabric in the opposite direction, you will begin to gather the fabric. To ensure I'm gathering the skirt to the correct width, I like to lay down my seamstress tape and do my gathering right next to it so that I'm constantly checking what length I have the skirt gathered to. The next step is also technically optional. Basically, all I'm doing in this step is putting a few stitches between where the front bodice pieces meet and where the back bodice pieces meet so that they don't shift around when I'm eventually attaching the bodice to the skirt. The next step is where we're going to attach the bodice to the skirt, finally. So, aligning the center front of your bodice pieces to the center front of your skirt, begin pinning both pieces together with the pins on the outside or on the right side of the garment. While it can be more challenging to pin from the right side of the garment, we're doing so intentionally because we want to be able to see our gathers going through the machine and be able to adjust them as we see fit. You can see in the video that I'm stopping and starting my machine with the needle in my fabric, lifting my presser foot and adjusting the gathering as needed. You're also going to want to leave about a 1/2 inch of gathering unsewn from both the left and right side of the garment where they meet in the center back. Attach and close the center back of the skirt using a French seam, which I detail in the pattern instructions. You're going to want to gather that remaining bit of fabric that you have not attached yet to the bodice. There's no way to perfectly explain this, you just have to play around with it. Then just sew the remaining gathering in place. We've reached the final step, which is hemming the skirt. All you're going to do here is a double fold hem, essentially just folding the hem about a 1/2 inch, pressing it, optionally stitching it, and then folding it up again another 1/2 inch, pressing it, and completing the final stitch. I opted to go back in and make another top stitch over top of that gathering slightly closer to the top edge of the skirt, just to kind of flatten down that top part of the gathering a little bit more. And that is the finished piece. Thank you so much for following my pattern for the Elizabeth Mini. If you make this dress for yourself, I would love to see any photos and videos you're willing to share. And I really hope you enjoyed the process. Thank you so much. Bye.